Well, Professor Mihály Tóth is an assistant professor at the Institute of Philosophy of the Hatzman Péter Catholic University near Budapest, Hungary, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in ethics, philosophical anthropology, and the history of modern philosophy. He has published an introduction to moral theology and co-authored Religion from the point of view of fundamental theology, both in Hungarian. He is the author of several articles, including Ethics, Theory or Praxis, Passion, Dissonance and Life Planning, and The Art of Caring for Ourselves. We're pleased to have you with us, Mihály, and we're interested in hearing about process thought after Marxism. Welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's a great honor that I can be here with you this afternoon, and I can share some thoughts about Protestantism and Marxism. I apologize in advance that my English is far from perfect. I will try to express myself as well as I can, and if you don't understand something, and after, if I don't understand some of your questions, we will try to find a solution to understand each other. So, first of all, I would like to say that in this small talk, I would like to talk mainly about the situation in Hungary, because I don't have the proper overview to talk about other countries. But I suppose that a similar situation is to be found also in other Eastern European countries. The first part, I would like to talk about the extent of Marxism in Hungary. Because many people in the Western world think, this is my experience, that the majority of the population in those countries belonged to the Communist Party and were Marxist, but this is not true. According to my information, the number of the members of the Communist Party, which was called Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party after the revolution in 1956, so the highest amount was about 700,000 people, and the population of Hungary was, and is now, about 10 million. So this number means about 7% of the whole population and about 10% of the adult population. But I have to add that most of these people who joined the party, they joined it first because of fear, for example, pressure at their jobs, if they had to go there, or simply opportunism, hoping privileges or advantages in the society, for example, promotion at their jobs or priority of their children at the entrance exam of universities and such things, and some of them simply of conformism. And only a few of them were convinced communists, and even less were conscious Marxists, because most of these people hadn't ever understood the essence of Marxism. So, although the official state ideology was called Marxism-Leninism, this was only maintained by the force of Soviet weapons and not by virtue of any common conviction of the population. Just a short example to illustrate the attitude of the majority of the people toward Marxism. They used a nickname for the Marxist evening or weekend schools, where most people were put in against their own will by their company's party secretaries. And these schools were called Foxy Moxy Institutes, which was the title of an American cartoon made by Walt Disney or Hanna-Barbera. I didn't find it, and unfortunately I don't know the title, but it was popular in Hungary in the middle of the 60s, and as well as I can remember, I saw it later, it was a white dog with black spots. So these schools were called by the name of this cartoon figure. And this shows clearly that how popular these schools were among the population. Briefly, Marxism in its proper philosophical sense was just a case for a minority of intellectuals. And in this respect, the situation was not so much different from the Western world. Now, in spite of this, there have been some long-term effects of the Marxist worldview, because many terms of a simplified version of Marxism, which we often call primitive or vulgar Marxism, influenced the thoughts of millions of Hungarians. Because we had to listen to these commonplaces and slogans from the kindergarten on and all the school years on and the universities. So much as meaningless or stupid they sometimes were, they just infiltrated into our brains and conditions our positions, our standpoints concerning many aspects of the world. And first phenomenon I would like to talk about is the attitude toward religion, because this attitude was considerably influenced by the Marxist approach to the subject. Marx once called religion the opium of the people, and this idea, taken out of its original context, led to the position of considering religion in general and each religious phenomenon individually as superstition, nothing else, a result of ignorance, powerlessness, and fear. Now, this concept of religion did not take notice of the existing differences between the various religious phenomena. And books written on the history of religions, according to this point of view, handled the ritual prostitution of ancient Mediterranean cults and the Eucharistic rites of Christian denominations at the same level. This sharply critical opinion about religion might have had its roots, in some cases, in Enlightenment traditions as well, because there were such traditions in Hungary, like in all European countries, but only in a small part of the population, first of all in some intellectual families. The general spread of negative prejudices and even hostility toward religion were due to the aggressive anti-religious propaganda of communist agitators in the years after the Second World War and the repression and persecution that followed for long decades. Two examples. Any kind of organized teaching of religion, whether made at churches or at private houses, was considered to be illegal, to be a crime. And priests and pastors attempting to care of the spiritual needs of young people were imprisoned, especially in case of young people, high school pupils or students, because the communists feared that they will be the new generation of intellectuals and they can change the society. So such sentences occurred until the mid-70s. So I personally know priests and pastors who went to prison for several years for this. And not only old men, they are still young, 50. And the second example, the church institutes were systematically demoralized by the communist state, first by means of the secret police in the 50s, and after the revolution 56, by the so-called state ecclesiastic office, which built up a net of informers among both clergymen and laymen. So they tried to demoralize church communities in this way. all these activities, the secret police activity and the activity of this office, was given up only in 1990, so 11 years ago. It's not so long ago. And these activities were controlled by the main ideologists of the communist regime, most of whom were Marxist philosophers at the same time, teaching at universities and working at other institutes. Now, I have to admit that some old resentments against the strict, hierarchical, feudalistic, and anti-democratic structures of several historical churches in Hungary, particularly of the Catholic Church, must have contributed to the relatively quick success of changing the human minds in this respect against religion. Because religion showed its particularly conservative face in Hungary between the two world wars. It had its historic causes. Hungary lost the majority of its territory after the First World War, and churches tried to proclaim we want to have back all these territories. So they acted as very conservative institutions. Now, the effect of these changes of attitude toward religion has been devastating, and this is no exaggeration, because the majority of 3 generations grew up without the chance having any access to realistic information and imagination of what religion actually was. I have my own experiences with students at the Faculty of Art in the 90s who could not distinguish between Islamic, Christian, or any other beliefs. They had no idea what belongs where, if there is a God in Buddhism or who is in Christianity, or who thought that it was a historically proven fact that the man called Jesus never existed, or that medieval monasteries were nothing else but homosexual communes, and so on. This is no joke. This happened to me in the classes. Now, an important supplement to the latter point is that this popular religious criticism was directed mainly toward monotheistic traditions, particularly against Judaism and Christianity, because these traditions had their historic roots in Hungary. And members of the same young generations accepted teachers and teachings of other, for example, Far Eastern religious traditions, most of which appeared in our country only after the political changes at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. They accepted all of this in a rush and without any criticism. And this shows clearly the intensity of their vital need of receiving religious orientation and answers of any religious kind, but the traditional ones. A second point, as for the long-term effects of Marxism, was the popular vulgar Marxist point of view that we can call scientific worldview and an exclusive materialism. This was a position, a belief in the unflagging progression of the natural sciences and technology, and it was a late and somewhat anachronistic heir of the scientific optimism of the 19th century. Now, the irony of this stiff point of view was that it remained skeptic against any newer development of sciences than in the 19th century. For example, quantum theory was considered as an obscure achievement of modern physics in the eyes of official Marxist ideologists. And in this sense, they could prevent several times the invitation of Werner Heisenberg, the famous German quantum physicist, to the Budapest University. It happened in the beginning of the 60s, the middle of the 60s. And another example, that innovative psychological and psychiatric research was simply forbidden during the 50s because the so-called scientific Marxist opinion, the official opinion was that there would be no mental diseases in the coming perfect society. So this kind of research and education is unnecessary. Now everybody can imagine the consequences of this. Even treatment was not allowed in many cases. And the third point is that there have been some devastating effects in the society as well. I think it was a counter effect of the official Marxist collectivism, which was a forced collectivism, that after the Second World War, because right after the Second World War, there were some years of strong solidarity and enthusiastic cooperation in the restoration of the country after the war damages. But some years later, and higher individualism grew in the society, and it grew to an extremely high extent. So sociologists say that by today Hungary is one of the most individualistic societies in the world. And this goes hand in hand with a very high rate of depression, alcoholism, divorce rate, suicide rate, low life expectancy, one of the lowest in Europe, in whole Europe, and very low birth rate on the other side. All this could be a result of cutting off the society from its historic roots, destroying traditional family structures and culturally inherited social relations, and replacing it by nothing but some utopian and consequently disappearing collectivist ideals. I don't want to maintain that only communism and Marxist ideology caused all this phenomena, but I think that they contributed at a high extent to the crisis. Instead of working against the alienation, as they claimed in the theory, these ideological factors proved to be alienating in the practice themselves. Now, I think that after this situation, after these decades of Marxism, and after the long-term effects of Marxism, there are some important chances of process thought in this situation. First of all, I have to say that at the moment, I see no real chance of efficient cooperation between Marxism and process thought in our country. I know that such philosophical attempts do exist, especially in the field of social theory. So anybody who wants to know more about it can go to the library, or for example, the Center for Process Studies has an excellent collection of such articles and also some books. So anybody who's interested can read these writings, but I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to underestimate the past and present influence of Marxism, and I am aware of its vivid presence at many universities, as well as in political movements all over the world. But I think that the future generations of Hungarian young men and women, and now I dare to say that generations of Eastern European young men and women, will not be particularly interested in Marxist philosophy, which already fulfilled its historic role in the life of these countries, and this was not a sublime role at all. My personal view is that Marxist ideology reached the climax of its development a long time ago, and since then its history has gone downwards. Basically, I agree with the diagnosis of Alistair MacIntyre, who in his famous book called After Virtue wrote the following: I couldn't say better, so I quote him. The claim of Marxism to a morally distinctive standpoint is undermined by Marxism's own moral history. In all those crises in which Marxism had to take explicit moral stances, that over Bernstein's revisionism in German social democracy at the turn of the century, or the Hungarian revolt in 1955, for example, Marxists have always fallen back into relatively straightforward versions of Kantianism or utilitarianism. In their practice, Marxists have exemplified precisely the kind of moral attitude which they condemn in others as ideological. Marxism has recommended itself precisely as a guide to practice, as a politics of peculiarly illuminating kind. Yet it is just here that it has been of singularly little help for some time now. Marxism is exhausted as a political tradition. This was the end of the quotation. Now, on the other hand, I think that the gradual withdrawal of Marxism from the philosophical thought prepares a unique chance for getting acquainted with progressive trends of contemporary philosophy, and I am convinced that process thought could be one of them. The general issues provided by process thought, like metaphysics, cosmology, aesthetics, or ethics, and its contribution to numerous specific topics, just as questions of education, social development, environment, feminism, and others, all these could find their place in the philosophical formation of future generations in my country. Of course, I do not believe that process thought will fill that vacuum all alone. I think that after an initial confusion, which takes place in our days, healthy philosophical pluralism will appear also in Hungary, and besides popular existentialist, analytic, and several postmodern approaches, process philosophy will have an inevitable place and role in this plurality after being virtually unknown for so many decades. Furthermore, process thought may play a significant role in mediating between science and religion. Firstly, by putting them to their proper places in human experience. Secondly, by developing a balanced relation to each one of them. And finally, by searching and finding the adequate relation between the two spheres of reality. I think that the contribution of process thought could be particularly important, even determining in this field, considering the special circumstances I outlined earlier in my presentation. And finally, in spite of all ecclesiastic conservatism and clerical narrow-mindedness, I also believe that after decades of repression, free theological research will regain its power, and Hungarian theologians may benefit of many achievements of process theology, particularly when dealing with questions of modern theism, practical theology, as well as interdenominational and interreligious dialogue. In this way, process thought may contribute to the revival of creative theological thinking in Hungary. Now, I have to say that I guess there will be some difficulties in this process, in the introducing of process thought. First difficulty is, in my opinion, it could be the acceptance at state universities in the country. Because the old Marxist intellectuals are still there. Even the same party functionaries 12 or 15 years ago. It was not so long ago, so they are there. And most of the present heads of departments come from among the primary or secondary students of the Hungarian Marxist philosopher György Lukács. The philosophical background of so-called philosophers of religion is somewhat interesting. If you have a look at their writings 20 or 30 years ago, it doesn't look like philosophy of religion at all. It was about some orthodox Marxist ideas, so it's hard to believe that they have changed completely. Because of the old reflexes, there is a fundamental distrust against any ways of thinking which attribute to metaphysics, and especially to religion, an important role without their systems. This would be the first difficulty. The second difficulty could be the acceptance by church institutions. In Hungary, there is conservative Catholicism. About 60% of the population belong to the Catholic Church. At least about 60% were baptized in the Catholic Church. And let me give some examples what I mean by this conservative Catholicism, especially in the field of theology. Some years ago, an excellent German book of Catholic dogmatics was translated into Hungarian, so-called Handbuch der Dogmatik, Handbook of Dogmatics. Maybe you can find it in the library. I haven't checked it. Now, I heard from one of the translators of these books that they had to leave out two topics of this translation. The topic of the virginity of Mary and the topic of the ordination of the women. Because the German version writes about these topics quite open-minded, and the translators were simply frightened what the church functionaries would say about this. So they simply left these topics out, and they did not appear in the Hungarian translation. Or, for example, there is a very important Hungarian Jesuit thinker, philosopher, who wrote a book still at the beginning of the 70s. The title was, written in German as well, Gottes Wirken in der Welt. It means God's work in the world. And this was an innovative work on creation and God's cooperation with the world and its creatures. But in this book, he wrote a new approach of creation, a new approach of this cooperation, but he never dared to translate this book into Hungarian because of the same reasons. And there are some reactions to modern exegetic works, because some exegetical works of German and English authors were translated into Hungarians, and some church publishers did not dare to publish these books. At the end, they found an editor who made it, and they were published. But then there were protests against the publication of these books. And the argumentation was, I quote, "Believers are not mature enough to face such modern theological issues." That you can imagine. Now, on the other hand, there is also conservative Protestantism in Hungary. The creationist movements appeared in Hungary only from the 80s. And there are some creationists among the traditional Protestant denominations. There are about 20% Calvinists in Hungary, and about 4 or 5% Lutherans. So both in these two traditional Protestant denominations and the newly introduced Protestant denominations, you can find a high number of creationist thinkers and even agitators. So they travel around the country and they hold lectures or seminars like this against science, against evolutionism, such things. But you know it from the United States, of course. Now, the conservative church leaders and theologians suspect heresy everywhere where they find unusual expressions and unusual images concerning basic Christian ideas, just as God, creation, and the nature of religion. And I think that in this respect, Protestantism could have difficulties with the traditional churches. And the third difficulty I see in the almost total absence of process literature from Hungarian libraries. I checked it today from the library, the online catalog, if I can find books of process thought in Hungarian libraries, and I was surprised because I found 2 of them. But some months ago I didn't find any of them. I found 2 books. One was the English version, so the original of Science and the Modern World, and I found 1 copy of the German translation of The Function of Reason. But that's all over Hungary, nothing else. Not even the 2 main national libraries and in the most important university libraries. I have my personal experience that most philosophers and theologians I asked, they haven't even heard of Whitehead, or even if they have known his name, they haven't had any idea of his work and its continuation by process thought. So if I say the name Whitehead and then I say the expression process thought, they don't know that there is a connection between the 2 things because in their minds there is no relation. And they don't know the contents of Whitehead and they don't know the contents of the work of other process thinkers, of course. Now, after all these difficulties, I yet think that there are some rays of hope. And I would like to give 5 examples that gives reason to hope that process thought can and will find its place in Hungarian philosophy. Some books written by Whitehead and written by other process thinkers became attainable in some Hungarian bookstores from the mid-90s. This is not common. I found them only in 1 or 2 special bookstores, but at least there was a possibility to find them. And the Hungarian translation of Process and Reality is ready, and it will be published still this spring. And the translation of other major works of Whitehead is in plan. So I think that this will be an important contribution to the introduction of process thought. Now the second ray of hope, in my opinion, is that one of the most important and influential Hungarian authors from the field of religiously inspired philosophies has studied Whitehead and other process thinkers intensively before he began his new synthetic work on metaphysics. So in this work he will refer to process thought and Whitehead himself, and he intends to discuss and use some ideas of process thought. This would be a second important contribution. Now, students at the universities and colleges seem to be very susceptible to accept ideas and terms of process thought when explaining metaphysical, cosmological, or anthropological, or other philosophical and theological problems. They are open to this kind of new philosophy. And the next one is that there are some scholars and scientists who are highly interested in knowing process philosophy closer and using its ideas in their research and in teaching, particularly in the field of philosophy of religion and philosophy of science. And as a fifth point, just some weeks before my arrival here, I arrived 3 weeks ago, so this was maybe 6 weeks ago, I heard of an initiation of some Hungarian natural scientists, biologists, physicists. This is the first serious project about the relation between science and religion in Hungary. And it focuses on the reception of Darwinism in Hungary. They plan conferences as well as publications. And some of the scientists participating in this project maintain to be influenced by process thought in their opening toward religious worldview. I think this will be a very important event. As a conclusion, let me tell you once again, I would like to emphasize, I firmly believe that process thought can and will find its place in the philosophic vacuum left after the explosion of the exclusivity of Marxism, so that it might contribute to the formation of the philosophical and theological thinking and worldview of the future generations of my country. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mihály. Why don't we start with our question and answer period? I'm assured that the refreshments will be delivered momentarily, but there's nothing to partake of yet, so why don't we do a little discussion with Mihály. Question over there, Phil.
I was interested in your comments of the resistance to quantum theory in the scientific community of Hungary. And I wonder if, A, is that turning around, and B, will that influence the way people see Whitehead?
It already turned around. So the thing I was talking about happened in the 60s, but in the 60s quantum theory was over 50 years old, over 60 years old altogether. But then it turned out, and there are of course some excellent Hungarian scientists and physicists who work with the newest achievements of quantum.
Fellow named Edward Teller over here.
Oh yes, but it's another story. He left Hungary a long time ago, I think still before the Second World War. But there are some young men, both in Hungary, both in foreign countries, so there is no problem with this anymore, of course. But when I went to high school, beginning of the 80s, that young teachers, because I went to a high school which belonged to university, and we had many young teachers who were in the last year of their major, and they came to practice in our high school. So they just talk about quantum theory and indeterminism, very, how to say that, very quiet, because they were afraid to talk about it loud. And it was still at the beginning of the 80s.
You talked about leaving out any reference to the ordination of women. What is the status of women in Hungary in general and in relation?
It's an interesting question. Well, you know, for this, you should know the whole history of Hungary, but I'm trying to summarize it brief. Well, Hungary is at the border of two cultures, of the Western European and the Eastern European cultures. So In Hungary, you find, on the one side, you find high emancipation because just like in the Western European countries, Hungary women were glad to go to the universities at the beginning of the 20th century, but it was characteristic for the city population. But in the countryside, especially in the eastern part of the country, you don't find it. There you find machoism, just like in Mexico. And the present situation, well, I think that, at least in my crisis, my circles, so young intellectuals, women are completely emancipated, and they work and act at the same level as men, and there is no significant difference.
Are they allowed equal access to the universities?
Of course, yeah, of course.
They can, it's just
They
a
can,
matter
the
of
majority
culture.
of the students are women. I think 70%.
And-
And they have better results than men.
Oh, well, we understand.
I have 3 questions. The first one has to do with your earlier part concerning the fate of Marxism. It seems to me that whenever a system of thought becomes official or ideological, supported by the state, it degenerates. And the situation is the same in China. There are very few truly people believing or even knowing the thought of Karl Marx, even though there's a complete edition of translation of Marx, Engels' work in Chinese.
Yeah.
But do you find that in Hungary there is any interest in the Frankfurt School, which is a returning to Karl Marx's own thinking, try to give new life? It becomes a creative, in fact, a creative movement for a while. That may serve to rejuvenate Karl Marx's thinking and put it in not only in its own context in the 19th century, but make it relevant to the 20th century development. My second question has to do with Whitehead's thinking. One appeal of Whitehead's thinking is his attempt to see the world as a whole. See it. This is a very important aspect of Whiteheadian thought, and that is it wants to enlarge the horizon of our thinking. But at the same time, this is also why it became a bit unpopular in, let's say, in American philosophy, which in the 50s and up to even the 80s was dominated by analytical philosophy, which tends to be micro-philosophy as against the Whiteheadian macro-philosophy, if that distinction means anything. And it seems to me that these two trends are somewhat universal. There are always people who want to see things in the broadest context, which would make them drawn to Whiteheadian thought. But there are also people who want to concentrate on small things, the specific issues, or even a kind of optimistic thinking. And this contrast is quite readily seen in the contrast between, let's say, Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, who champions a kind of atomism, and who thinks that the question about the universe are nonsense. You can't talk about the world as a whole. Do you find that these two trends are present in Hungarian philosophers? Would this interest in analytic or micro-philosophy be a resistance also to Whiteheadian thought? my third question is very small. You mentioned that there is a copy of Whitehead's Process and Reality in the library.
Science and modern.
Oh, not Process, but you mentioned that the Process and Reality is being translated.
Yes, that's right.
Now, is that the corrected edition or the original Cambridge University Press edition? Because it seems to me quite an important difference. And with the corrected edition, we can forget about the original.
We all say it was the corrected edition. We were watching it happen last year.
Pretty
sure.
Correct.
Yeah, the corrected edition.
So is that translation into Hungarian from the corrected edition?
Yeah,
We're
they say
voting
that.
with it.
I only
We
know
think
the
so.
translator, but not the translation itself, because it hasn't been published yet. But the guy who translated it worked here last year, so
Oh, okay.
members of the process Center for Process Studies saw that work, and
Would
they
that
say
board?
that it was the
Yeah, board.
board. Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay. So you have the answer for your third question. As for the first two questions, I know the Frankfurt School and some philosophers know it, but there is not much interest in the philosophy of Frankfurt School in Hungary. Situation is somewhat similar, like with the works of Whitehead. I think just maybe one or two works have been translated into Hungarian. So most people who don't speak foreign languages do not have access to this kind of philosophy at all. And at the universities, my experience with my students is that they heard the name of Habermas, sometimes Adorno, and some of the other great names, but they have no idea of the contents of this philosophy. So at the moment, I don't see much interest. Maybe it will come later, because I think that this kind of revised Marxism can find its place in this philosophical plurality, which will come now, but it's not yet there. And to your second questions, yes, you are right. Maybe I should complete my list of possible difficulties of process thought, because there is a strong analytic tradition now in Hungary. Because in the 80s, when official Marxism began to lose its strength, some young philosophers turned toward some new trends in philosophy, and analytic philosophy was excellent choice, because just a few people understood what it was about. So they could make their researches in peace and nobody disturbed, because the official ideologists had no idea what it was about, so they didn't care a lot. There is an analytic tradition in Hungary, maybe there will be some resistance, but one of the authors, well, I talked about this new initiation about the relation between science and religion. And some of the philosophers who participate in this, it comes from the analytic tradition, but now it seems to be influenced by process thought. So maybe there will be resistance, but also some mediating as well.